Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse. You're on the Bible Forum. We do this every Sunday night from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, and we look at life through a biblical lens. We try to solve all the world's problems in 2 hours or less. A lot of things have been going on here in the last week or so that jump up at me, and I thought I'd share with you what a sheriff was talking about out in Milwaukee. Guy's name is David Clarke. He's an outspoken sheriff in Milwaukee County. You see him on television every once in a while. He shows up on different news talk type shows. He was on Sean Hannity's show lately. He was referencing what was going on with the Trump rally. Forgotten now, it was out in California, I guess. Whether it was the Sanders or the Hillary people, somebody ganged up on the supporters, people that had gathered to hear what Trump had to say. They terrorized them. One woman is pictured being pushed against the door of the supermarket that got eggs in her hair. I mean, so it was under the heading of terrorism. And he's responding to the city mayor, who seemed to point the finger at Trump. Said that Donald Trump was bearing some of the blame for this because of his rhetoric. Well, here comes Sheriff Clarke, looking at violence every day in his job, realizing from a practical point of view what's going on. And he actually said that this is reminiscent of how Southern blacks were treated in the Jim Crow era. Sheriff Clarke is black. Well, this premeditated, organized violence and these riot makers show up at these events with specific goals in mind. And then the mayor speaking out, instead of putting this in a proper perspective, tries to make it look like it's the Trump supporters who put themselves at risk and it's their fault. He said to Hannity, what I'm ticked off about right now is why Attorney General Loretta Lynch, who's also black, has not dispatched the FBI and dispatched lawyers from the Civil Rights Division to investigate and to prosecute, to identify people who are using the same type tactics that were used in the Jim Crow South to frighten and to intimidate blacks from participating in the voting process. You got to admire the logic. He says that's why this stuff is done. It's designed to strike fear and to intimidate these people who want to come and hear the candidate of their choice. An event that is constitutionally protected. This is a civil rights violation, the sheriff said. And they're entitled to that same equal rights protection under the law as anybody else or any of the other protected class. He said, it appears to me that the United States Department of Justice doesn't care what happens because these people are white, because these people are Trump supporters. I tell you, that's why you gotta love county sheriffs. I don't know if you understand this or not. We don't get taught stuff like this in school anymore. But the county sheriff is the only constitutionally established law enforcement officer in the country. There are people in this country, admittedly living out in the woods, on the mountains, away from society, who will not surrender to anybody but a county sheriff. Because everybody else wearing the badge and carrying the gun, they're bureaucrats. They work for the court system. They answer to the county prosecutor. When I was chaplain for the police department, I was also the ranking officer in their auxiliary department force. I got in meetings in other places where I heard this stuff going on. Local police departments they pretty much have to do what the county in New Jersey, they call them prosecutors. Here, I forget what they call them in North Carolina. It was different, but it's the same thing. Whoever is the highest, I guess, elected lawyer in the county tells the sheriff tells the police department what to do and how to go about it. It's an amazing thing. Sheriffs are elected by the people. Long live Sheriff Clarke. Have you ever used Google Images as a search engine? It's really neat. And when you get my email, which you should get every week, it has a nice picture of me on the front of it, or on the top of it. Down a little bit further are other pictures that highlight some of the things we're going to be talking about. But those pictures, they come from Google Images. What you do is you type in what you're looking for, or something close to what you're looking for. And the search engine parameters are designed in such a way as to go out there and find the pictures that correspond to those words based on their popularity, how many times they've been accessed. If people like looking for that, then they throw all those in the same pot. Well, now, apparently, if you type in the word three teenagers, you will see a variety of images. If you type in white teenagers, you will see a page full of fresh-faced, clean-cut, fun-loving teenagers. If you type in black teenagers, what you largely will find are mugshots. Well, now somebody has jumped up and said, this is racist. This is not right. This is against the law, and they want it stopped. Now, it's making the rounds on Twitter, which is as valuable as you might imagine. But all of the liberal Google, is now being charged with this. Their algorithm is in question, but it's blind. It's not a person. In an email statement, Google said its image search results are a reflection of what's on the web, including the frequency with which certain types of images appear and how they're described. These results, Google says, do not reflect Google's opinions or beliefs, at least not as a company. And as a company, we strongly value a diversity of perspectives, ideas, and cultures. One young black man thinks that all of this is just wrong. And just because black males are making poor choices doesn't mean black people should be stereotyped. UCLA Information Studies and African American Studies professor Safiya Noble says society should not let Google off the hook so easily. Well, I got a news flash for Safiya. That's another stereotype. Black Americans who adopt Muslim or Arab-sounding names to show solidarity or to reject their slave names. Now, I don't know if Safiya has done this or if that's her given name, but her last name is not Muslim. And I do know in America, people generally don't get this sort of name at birth unless they are first-generation immigrants or their parents are trying to come up with something that reflects what they believe and do. I mean, some of the names that come out of these people groups, I couldn't think of the right word, are very strange. Now the point is that young black males and females just don't get it. These photos are not chosen to highlight one class or character or group of people over another. They reflect what's being done on the internet, what people are looking for, what they find when they go looking for these things. These are search results among similar topics and subjects. If you want to stop these results, then stop searching for black mugshots. Or you could take responsibility as a young black man or woman and begin to work to change the black culture so there's not so many of these mugshots available. This comes under the heading of telling me my room is messy. How dare you say my room is messy? That's bigoted. No, not if your room is messy. Remember the story years ago? Classic story called The Emperor That Had No Clothes. If we lift the curtain on liberal America's love affair with slavery, it's the year 2016. It's been 151 years since slavery was outlawed in America. Former Attorney General Eric Holder, who is black, has come out against fingerprinting Uber drivers. Never mind the sheer potential for crimes committed by unvetted, uncontrolled drivers. Never mind the taxi drivers and the limo drivers who have had to submit to this for years. He doesn't want Uber drivers to be fingerprinted. He says to do so is racist. Why? Well, apparently there's a lot of Uber drivers who are black. Is it racist? More than 600,000 Americans lost their lives in the struggle we now call the war between the states. Some mistakenly call it the Civil War. It wasn't. America has since spent more money and more political capital on the descendants of those slaves than on any other social issue. And yet it's as though slavery exists today when you listen to the voices of minority Americans in the public square. Can anyone remember their great-great-great-great-great-grandparents? Does any other ethnic group still demand redress for sins committed against their ancient descendants? Sins which were admitted, sins which were repented of, sins which were redressed at the highest levels of government. In Western society, Muslims who have killed, butchered, enslaved, and robbed millions of non-Muslims throughout the world for over 500 years are not looked upon nor treated as badly as our non-Negro Americans. There is even a black Muslim group. Cassius Clay was one of them. Muhammad Ali. In the 21st century, black-skinned Americans are treated as a protected race for fear of stirring up not simply black-skinned people, but all who believe these folks are being discriminated against every day of their life by people like me, people who have white skin, people who simply hate everybody who doesn't look like them. That the proof is non-existent doesn't matter. In 1776, a sufficient number of votes in Philadelphia existed to outlaw slavery. It was discussed. 8 colonies were against it, but it didn't happen. It didn't happen because of logic, reason. It didn't happen because without the southern colonies, who were never going to go along with this, fledgling America would not have survived 20 minutes against Great Britain. The promise was that slavery would be abolished by, I think it was 1880. It's like 100 years. Over the next 100 years, we'll deal with it. Might have been sooner. The 5 colonies that ended up seceding from the Union presented just such a scenario. one which newly inaugurated President Abraham Lincoln saw clearly would be catastrophic if it were to stand. It would so weaken the Union. In response, Lincoln called up an army to put down the rebellion. That there was no rebellion has sort of been swallowed up in the memory hole that is our corporate shame over slavery. The 10th Amendment had been ratified in 1791, giving the states the power to do exactly as the Confederate States did in 1860. As a result, Lincoln's call to arms was an abuse of power. It was unconstitutional. It was provocative. The Confederate States felt bound to raise their own army to protect themselves. And we got a war out of it. The Emancipation Proclamation, delivered 2 years later in 1863, was Lincoln's way of legitimizing the conflict. He was having an awful time. Having been elected on an anti-slavery ticket, Lincoln saw the opportunity to fulfill his campaign promise. Most Americans believe the war between the states today was about slavery, when it was simply because of slavery. A distinction without a difference. But did you notice Lincoln was a Republican? First one. It was Republicans that reconstructed the South after the war, and that's why there are so many Democrats in the South. Reconstruction was horrendous. It was Republicans that fought against the KKK and the Jim Crow laws. It was a Republican-dominated Congress and a Republican president that passed the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction in 1957. Less than 2 years after the struggle had begun in Montgomery, Alabama. The demeaning and often violent treatment of those early civil rights marchers, nonviolent demonstrators, and students seeking an education in white schools transcended Americans' tolerance for injustice. It would take another 9 years for a Democrat president to embrace the civil rights struggle in any meaningful way, signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act into law and then later the 1965 Voting Rights Act. These two bills have served to keep liberal Democrats in power ever since. These laws are useful in the sense that Democrats have continually used them to curry favor with black voters and to keep their power. The argument is about 200 years of abuse imposed upon these folks. That none of these former slaves have been alive for at least 60 to 80 years doesn't seem to make a difference. Their children, their grandchildren, their great-great-grandchildren are still supposedly suffering from this injustice. How? Well, through racism and bigotry, through discrimination due to the color of their skin, through the lack of opportunity and education afforded these folks simply because of the color of their skin. Is any of that true? Well, yeah. There are pockets. There will always be pockets of bigotry and discrimination in any culture. Human beings come in all sizes, shapes, and biases. Is any of this public policy? Any of this a general rule of thumb? No. Most Americans accept people as they find them. When you see a person turning their backs on another person, it's almost universally due to the shunned person's continued attitude and behavior. That slavery in America continues to be a favorite electioneering tool of Democrats was, once again, illustrated by our First Lady just in the last couple of weeks as she spoke at a graduation ceremony this year. Reflecting on the marvelous opportunities available in this country, she couldn't resist pandering to the well-worn narrative slavery. She said, "It is the story that I witness every single day when I wake up in a house that was built by slaves." What? Yeah, there were 5 of them. There were others in the quarry in Maryland, but working in Washington, D.C., there were 5 of them. And that's only because they couldn't get any other help. They went to Europe, they were looking for it, they couldn't. And so they paid big landowners who had slaves, and they sent them. They had skills. And I watched my daughters, 2 beautiful black young women, head off to school, waving goodbye to their father, the President of the United States, a son of a man from Kenya who came here to America for the same reasons as many of you, to get an education, to improve his prospects in life. Can you hear it? Yeah. America is the land of opportunity, even for a black man and his family. However, it is strewn with injustice, perhaps even now. Keeping black folks out of schools, keeping them from finding work. If so, the courts are more than ready to put a stop to that. And buses are still running. The last time I looked, we're a very mobile society. There's no work here, you can move. I talked to a black man today who grew up here in South Carolina and graduated high school and left South Carolina because there were no jobs here. What's that make him? Smart. That's what it makes him. And he ended up in Ohio. He found out there was winter up there. Boy from South Carolina, you don't know about winter. He had relatives in New Jersey, so he went there, and he ended up working 20-some years for a company there. Got married, started a family. The company sold out to somebody else, and things moved around. He was out of work for 2 months. Got another job, worked 25 years for them, retired. He moved back home. It can still be done. Say, yeah, well, we had presidents that owned slaves. Yeah, we did, but not all of them. George Washington owned slaves. John Adams didn't. Thomas Jefferson succeeded Adams. He had slaves, but he wrote that slavery was an assemblage of horrors. James Madison, Jefferson's successor, held slaves all his life, including when he was in office. But one of his slaves, a fellow by the name of Paul Jennings, wrote the first White House memoir, a colored man's reminiscence of life in the White House. In the book, Jennings called Madison, quote, one of the best men that ever lived, end of quote. He said Madison never would strike a slave, although he had over 100, neither would he allow an overseer to do it. Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, all owned slaves, but not during their time in office. Did I tell you there was no Republican Party at that time? Abraham Lincoln was the first Republican president, some 68 years after this union was begun. And he ran on an anti-slavery platform and won. It was Republicans who freed the slaves, not Democrats. It was the Democrat Party, Barack and Michelle's party, that fought integration and civil rights legislation in the South for generations. The Ku Klux Klan was the armed militia of the Democrat Party, lynching almost as many white Republicans as they did innocent blacks during the war between the states. The Democrats have gotten wealthy on the strength of black voters, while the black family has suffered greatly, and the black community has become poorer and more dependent upon the government because of liberal Democrat legislation and efforts. By any measure, the black community generally has all but returned to slavery under Democrat rule. But nobody is willing to say the emperor has no clothes. When the history books are written, they will no doubt ignore the social destruction caused by civil rights legislation. They will no doubt ignore the ravages of abortion on demand upon the black family, paid for by a guilt-stricken government. More black babies have died than all the slaves in America. Where's their political savior? More young black males are in prison than any other ethnic or racial group. And that too apparently is my fault because I'm white. More black children grow up without fathers, many times without mothers. If it weren't for grandmothers, many black children would not know a mother's care. Alcohol, drugs, sex, violence, and hopelessness stalk the black community. And all that's my fault because I'm black. I'm white. I'm not black. I'm white. But you see, that sentiment is racist. And we're about to elect a woman to president who has stomped all over these people her entire life. Pandered, bribed, persecuted, mocked minority groups, especially black folks, as she clawed her way into the history books. I'm not saying she don't care about them. I'm saying she doesn't care about anyone but herself. She has used her husband. She has used her daughter. More than one person who knows has written about how she gave birth because it made Bill more appealing to voters. She didn't want a baby. Dolly Kyle, a woman that Bill had sex with for decades, has written a scathing portrayal of Hillary Rodham in a book entitled Hillary, the Other Woman. She knows her. When the objective story is told, there's going to be a lot of guilt to go around. And not just white people.